80% of drugs prescribed to Americans are generic drugs. 40% of drugs are now made overseas in countries like China and India, where U.S. oversight is weaker. Senior correspondent John Miller has been looking at one of those companies called Ranbaxy. John, good morning.
Good morning, Charlie and Nora. Dinesh Thakur, an American-educated chemical engineer, was hired by Ranbaxy back in 2003. He would later become a whistleblower, exposing massive fraud by the generic pharmaceutical giant. It's a company that sold Americans drugs like the generic version of Lipitor. His information led Ranbaxy to plead guilty to 7 felonies in a U.S. court in May and pay $500 million in fines and settlements.
The expectation is the drug's supposed to work as intended. What we saw in this particular case is that trust was broken. You kind of have...
Dinesh Thakur began looking into Ranbaxy while he was still an executive there in 2004. When you asked for the data, it was a black hole?
It was a lot of pulling teeth.
Generic drug companies like Ranbaxy have to prove their drugs are bioequivalent. That means they have the same effect as the brand name. Thakur found Ranbaxy's drugs were being made for Americans with bioequivalence data that either didn't exist or was made up altogether.
The key question here is that does a drug work as intended? And do you have the confidence that the drug works as it is intended to do?
But the confidence would largely have to be based on the quality of the data.
Oh, absolutely.
And without the data?
You don't know. You don't know.
Thakur reported his findings to the FDA in 2005. Their investigation found Ranbaxy had a persistent pattern of submitting untrue statements. On at least 15 new generic drug applications, auditors found over 1,600 data errors. This meant their drugs were potentially unsafe and illegal to sell.
In essence, they used the fraud as a competitive advantage to build and grow the business here in the U.S.
Vince Fabiano is a former Ranbaxy vice president.
Or let's say you're treated with a generic cancer drug, and your cancer progresses. Is it because of the drug? Is it because of the disease process? No one would know, and it's harm that in many cases would not be detectable.
In 2008, shortly after Ranbaxy came under new ownership, the FDA blocked 30 Ranbaxy drugs from coming into the United States from 2 Indian plants. But the company continued to sell drugs in the U.S. from other Indian facilities. Then, in 2011, while one arm of the FDA was investigating Ranbaxy for serious criminal violations, another arm of the FDA was approving the company for the exclusive rights to make the generic version of one of the most popular pharmaceuticals of all time, Lipitor. A decision by the FDA that reportedly earned the company $600 million in the first 6 months. David Nelson led a congressional investigation into Ranbaxy.
There was behavior treatment that was suggestive of regulators that at best didn't care and at worst were complicit in the activities of this firm.
Ranbaxy's new owners say they've spent $300 million to upgrade their facilities. We wanted to look inside Ranbaxy today. So we traveled to India to visit the rural Tawansa facility. Active pharmaceutical ingredients are made here, the key ingredient that makes a drug work. Despite the manicured grounds and the catchy safety slogans, this facility has run into serious problems with the FDA. In 2012, Ranbaxy issued a recall after finding glass particles in raw ingredients for generic Lipitor. Later that year, at another Ranbaxy plant, FDA inspectors found faulty cleaning records and a failure to investigate problems. Ranbaxy declined our request for an interview, but in a statement said, Ranbaxy is committed to providing high-quality, affordable drugs to patients in the U.S. and will take all measures to keep facilities in full compliance to all regulations.
It's a very long and lonely process, and I'm sure...
As for Dinesh Thakur, his findings led Ranbaxy to plead guilty to 7 felonies. For exposing the company, he was awarded $49 million in a U.S. court. Somewhere in some company, there could well be someone who is seeing the same things that you saw.
Mm-hmm.
What would you say to them? What should they do?
They should follow their conscience. They should follow their conscience and do what it says that they ought to do.
Despite these ongoing manufacturing failures, Ranbaxy sold nearly $1 billion worth of drugs to Americans last year. But just 2 weeks after we visited their Indian facilities, the FDA blocked a third Ranbaxy plant in India from selling drugs to the U.S.
So, John, can Ranbaxy sell drugs to U.S. customers?
So, Nora, following the most recent FDA action, the company's finished drugs are now all made in the U.S., but the company still makes the key ingredients for U.S. drugs like AstraZeneca's Nexium in India. Now, AstraZeneca tells us Ranbaxy is one of 2 suppliers, and the company strictly controls standards in the Ranbaxy plant. Nexium, of course, was the highest selling drug in the U.S. last year.
Thank you, John. John will have more of the investigation tonight on the CBS Evening News with Scott Pelley.